Somewhere out there, in a classroom or staying up late at home, a teacher is planning that next great lesson that will inspire and change a child's life. Whether they're looking for new, innovative ways to engage and motivate students, or connecting learning to real life in a hands-on way, it's always with the end in mind and the context of global citizenship and advancing our humanity. Join us on our search for leading voices in education across the globe as we convene to talk about the topics that matter and inspire all educators in the pursuit of that next great lesson. Welcome to Educators Without Borders, presented by SchoolRubric.
Welcome to another episode of Educators Without Borders, hosted by SchoolRubric. Today's discussion is the second part of a two-part series on the future of schools. What's possible, what's practical, and how do we get there? I'm Zach Cohen, Middle School Director, ASCD Emerging Leader, Core Collaborative Consultant, and blogger for Student Achievement Partners, and I'm honored to be the facilitator for today's conversation. Once again, we have an esteemed collection of panelists, each of whom brings a diverse array of experiences and a depth of knowledge to our conversation about what is frankly a pretty complex and provocative topic. Especially as the COVID-19 pandemic begins to wane, we're left to make sense of the extent to which these past 2 years have served or will continue to serve as a catalyst for change, the kind of change that isn't just conceptual or marooned to unheralded outposts, but is actually tangible and systemic. Right? Just recently, I received a newsletter from the Big Questions Institute that suggested that there exists a very real chasm between promise in rhetoric and appreciable change in education over these past 2 years. Now, I think this is a largely debatable point, right? There have been exquisite examples of innovation in schools and classrooms around the world. But what I is that pockets of innovation can stagnate at scale and can feel quite lonely to those educators who sense that they're seeking to go about it alone. And that's kind of the point of our coming together today. We might be able to glimpse what the future of schooling looks like, but where do we go from here? If there remains a gap between what schooling should be and what it is, what can we do about it? Now, before we dive into the meat and potatoes of these questions, let's go ahead and meet our panelists. Homa, let's start with you. Could you share a little bit about yourself, your work, and maybe something that you're working on that you're finding particularly exciting at the moment?
Sure. Thank you so much, Zach. I'm just really delighted to join all of you today and be part of this conversation, which I really think is such a really crucial conversation to be having. So my background, as many, I think these days, it's not a straight line. It's sort of a meandering path that led me to education or back to education. I worked for close to 20 years on economic development and strategic sort of international development with governments and businesses around the world. And shortly after 9/11, as a mother myself, I was really concerned about what the relationship our own children would be to the wider world that seemed to be sort of eroding with more fear taking over than cooperation and collaboration. And I sort of dove into questions of how do we begin to, or how do we deepen global citizenship for our children, which naturally led to questions around equity and justice and what we're doing in schools to really kind of lean into this future that we're living in. And so that's taken many different forms, a number of different books and publications. And today, my focus is in the Big Questions Institute, which you mentioned. I'm really happy that you brought that up. And that's been just really incredible work that is centered on fearless inquiry And I also am the co-founder of the Oneness Lab, which is seeking to sort of move beyond transactional equity work to more relational. And all of these are connected. And I'm just really delighted to be with all of you today. Thanks. Oh, and something I'm working on that I'm excited about. So last year, through the Big Questions Institute, we published and have been giving away a book called The 9 Big Questions Schools Must Answer So They Don't Go Back to Normal, because normal wasn't that great to begin with. And now, sort of the expansion and the connection with many educators around the world on this book, we have a couple new questions to add to that. And we are working on, and I am not going to say it's easy. Like, it's a really hard project to create sort of an update to the book that is responsive to the moment that we're in and whatever is going to come next. So 11 big questions, and I'll hold off and maybe leave folks in suspense what the 2 new questions are. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Homa. I can tell you, I'm certain that at this point, my own faculty is tired of hearing about these 9 big questions. So I'm sure they're going to be relieved to know that they're going to have 2 new ones that I'm going to be sharing with them.
Or hate it.
Yeah.
I think the 2 new ones are actually, they're almost more fun. They're really interesting, and it's just comes out of an organic conversation, and maybe I'll talk about them if it seems appropriate.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And Patrice, what about yourself?
Hi. So, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you, especially discussing a topic that's really near and dear to me. I am the Director of Organizational Learning at the Carnegie Foundation. And prior to me joining the foundation, I was in the K-12 sector. So I was a kindergarten teacher, instructional coach, and assistant principal in middle school. So definitely a difference between where I started and where I ended. And then I also am an emerging leader as well with ASCD, and serve on our board of directors for the organization. And a part of my passion for what we're going to discuss really comes from a part of my career that was like game changing for me and helped me really see that there's a lot that can happen in education. I was a fellow at the U.S. Department of Education for 2 terms. And a part of my responsibility and role there was to actually go across the country and highlight innovations that we were seeing in schools and innovative practices, and just people who were eliminating the box of what education looked like. And so that sparked my passion for being able to imagine what the future of learning and teaching in school could be.
Awesome.
And so what I'm working on right now is actually at the foundation. One of our strategic priorities is the future of learning. So we have a brand new partnership that is with XQ Rethinking High School. So a part of that is really thinking about the high school portion, but then we're even branching further out and thinking about what does the future of learning look like beyond the scope of just that one institution in our system.
Patrice, it sounds like everything in your background has been leading you to this moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like I'm wholeheartedly walking in my purpose at this moment.
This is great. And Ewan, what about yourself?
So I'm a French and German teacher from high school background, quite a while ago now, and worked in a government level in education, and that's where I really got into connecting with educators around the world through weblogs, which at the time were relatively new, and I used to be able to read everyone's weblog in a morning. It was those were the kind of heady days where it felt like something new. But now, and for the past 12 years, I've worked in my own firm, Notosh, with a team all over the world, in Australia, in Japan, in across Europe, and I think that the work that we do tends to fall into 3 big buckets. I think one is we start new schools with people, with really exciting people, and we're very picky about who we work with on that. So starting new schools, transforming quite traditional schools into something more akin to the innovative visions that they would like to try and fulfill. And we are doing that thing that the email newsletter challenged. We are moving people from nice ideas to pragmatic reality. We're working with schools in 62 countries at the moment on live projects, and all helping them establish their vision and the strategy to realise it, and then holding their hands on those first tricky steps as they make the change happen. But we're also working at a national level here in Scotland, in some of the Australian states and in the Middle East, on making that change across whole countries and whole systems. And coming out of the past couple of years, I think much like individuals have done that at home, they've been reflecting on their job and what they want out of life, and they want to spend more time with their family. Whole systems are actually thinking really carefully, what's the point of our school system? And so, I think everything's maybe led me to this podcast, in that's the question that's very much at the front of my mind and my team's mind at the moment. And I think the third part of our work is really developing leadership, particularly middle leadership. I think the past couple of years, you've seen senior leaders and even school boards having to take quite minute, daily, detailed decisions. And it's almost like their leadership muscle is absolutely stressed and taut. And this is the period where middle leadership need to stand up, almost like middle leadership yoga. They need to relax that muscle and have more distributive leadership. But how you go about doing that is often a mystery. So we've got 300 incredible aspiring and current middle leaders going through our cohorts of leading from the middle, an online program only. We don't do any face-to-face on it, and it's having really amazing benefits in person, in real life, if you like, in the schools where people are participating in it.
I love that idea of, if we're seeking to scale innovation, we can't look to the top, but actually we should be looking to the middle. Thanks for that, Hugh, and I look forward to getting into that a little bit more kind of as we continue on. I would hope that kind of just like me, you're all just as excited to share today as you are to learn from your fellow panelists. And so I think we should start getting into it. And I guess before we post our first question, I do want to share that our questions today actually come from our last three panelists, Vriti Sarif, Tim Fish, and Allegria Barclay. And we asked them what questions they wanted the three of you to answer. And so these are the three questions that they came up with. And so whenever we're ready, let's go ahead and share that first question.
Now more than ever, there are new tools, resources, technology, and methodologies that help connect learners with knowledge, skills, and information. So, as we enter into an age of democratized learning, why should schools continue to exist?
Yeah, so Homa, let's start with you, right? Information is now more readily available and accessible outside of a classroom than inside a classroom. So why should schools continue to exist? Oh, Homa, we were bound to say it at least
Hello.
once, right?
Hello, unmute. Okay. So I was just saying that I think a lot of people are asking this question, and they should. And honestly, when I see, it's beautifully produced question. When we close our eyes and we think about school and we see children sitting in rows waiting for someone to give them information, that is not why schools should exist anymore. I think we have to really envision something new that is relevant, just, sustainable, healthy. We have been asking our first of the 9 big questions, what is sacred? What is sacred about schools? And asking parents, teachers, leaders, and students all over the world the question of what is sacred, which I think gives a bit of an answer to why should schools exist. And unanimously, everybody says what is sacred is relationship, connection, belonging, joy, curiosity, sort of in that order. We learned through the pandemic that we seek relationship. As humans, we are relational. And schools should not exist to replicate what the algorithm can do better. But what we crave, what we need to build vibrant communities, to be part of a world that feels better, honestly, than a lot of what's happening now, it kind of starts with those. So I think to get to why schools should exist, we can open the question, what is sacred about school that we hope would exist in 10 to 20 years if we were to return to our schools? And it's those vital relationship, connection, joy, belonging.
Yeah.
But I think also the question's loaded in a way, because it talks about learning being democratized, and I would argue it's not at all. Knowledge is. So finding out stuff, finding out information is democratized, but it depends on knowing the question you want to ask. So what's been democratized is the ability to find out the answer to the question you know you don't know the answer to, the known unknowns. I don't mean to go kind of Rumsfeld on you, but the known unknowns that you can ask with a question, that's what the internet, that's what has been democratized. What's not been democratized is the ability to ask the right question, which is the question that you cannot answer because it's the unknown unknown. So when my daughters headed off to school this morning, I hope that they bumped into something that they didn't even know they didn't know. And those are the days they come in, they go, you'll never believe what I've discovered. You'll never believe the project that we're doing. You'll never believe the thing that's just come out. And so it's no surprise the subjects, the areas that my kids and many kids find fascinating are things like theory of knowledge, philosophy, religious moral education. Why? Not because they want to be priests, it's because they want to talk about philosophical ideas that are ungoogleable. And so for, it's 12 years since I wrote the blog post saying, schools should really be about ungoogleable thinking. And yet, I guarantee you can walk down the corridor of most high schools, certainly, and unfortunately many middle schools and elementary schools, and you will see a teacher stood out front narrowing down the knowledge, what's the word I'm looking for? Undemocratizing the knowledge. Because they believe there's this hierarchy. And I loved the late Sir Ken Robinson's take on the hierarchy of school subjects. My mother was an English teacher, right at the top of the pile, and my dad was a music teacher, lowest of the low. Until, of course, the middle-class parents want to see their little Jemima playing violin in a concert, in which case music suddenly becomes more important. But that hierarchy of knowledge is such a pre-Google idea. And building on Homa's point, the point of school is, when I speak with school boards and leadership teams, it's community building, it's relationships, it's learning how to actually interact with each other in both very informal ways, but also on the tough topics, like what's going on in the world today and why does it happen, and why are people the way they are around topics that make no sense to me or no sense to you. And those are the kinds of discussions kids need to learn how to have. You don't just naturally have the capability to do that. It needs taught, not caught, and that takes a lot of time. It takes a school career.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Patrice, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I definitely want to build on what Homa and both of you shared. We just had our summit, and I just flew from there yesterday, and our closing keynote was Father Boyle from Homeboy Industries. And one of the things that he talked about was the power of kinship, and that kinship is what creates peace and justice and community, and just all these things that as human beings we seek, we need in order to thrive. And that really resonated with me. And when Homa, you asked the question, what is sacred? That I just thought about, like, the power of kinship is what's sacred and what is really why schools should continue to exist, because they are that place of where togetherness can thrive, where kinship could thrive, where we could come together around things, around justice and equity and peace. And so when you think about my take on it is more along the relational side of things. Like, why? Because those are the things that no computer, no piece of technology can ever compensate for. They can help create that connectivity, but it cannot. It's unmatched when you think about the human touch.
there's a really interesting, the word kinship is interesting. So I understand it in the way you understand it, I think, but there's actually a Scottish definition of the word kinship, a legal definition, and it's about looking after children formally. And it's about looking after your fellow being formally, and doing that is a way to create a society where everyone's got someone looking out for them. And it builds on the idea of community in the village. It takes a village to raise a child. And it's quite a controversial thing legally, of course, because you're implying maybe not all parents look after their kids the way they should look after them. So we're going to have a formal mechanism to make sure every child's got someone looking after them. But I actually like it as a notion that we look out for each other formally. It's not left to chance.
Yep.
I'm just going to also just underscore what you both said. I love the idea. I think there's a framework that we use at the Oneness Lab that focuses on kinship as well, that allyship still has a bit of distance between people, that you can sort of watch what happens and not really engage in very actively. Kinship, like when you think about what would you do for your family? What would you do for your child? If your child was sick, you wouldn't stop at the first answer, the first opinion. If it didn't satisfy you, you would ensure that whatever you could do, you wouldn't stop. So kinship is that going so much farther than what allyship can be.
And you can push that, I think, even further. The challenge of school, I think, as well, is wrapped up in the idea of success, which is often tied up as individual success. Right. So when you start talking about kinship, there's an implication that of the we rather than the I. And we did a really fantastic collaborative process to create a new strategy for a school in Johannesburg. And what we realised there was that there was a lot of work to be done in developing the sense of mutual success, not just individual success. Very high-powered school, high academic success. And there's the South African concept of Ubuntu, where in order for me to do well, you also have to do well. It's actually, I don't think it's particularly South African. I think it's actually how the best schools operate. The best organisations, whether it's the Duke of Edinburgh Award, where, okay, I'm getting a gold level Duke of Edinburgh, but actually the other 6 people in my expedition also have to get their gold with me. So we're going to look out for each other and help each other out. Or Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, you name it. All these organisations, all these youth organisations are built on the idea of looking out for your fellow person. Why in school do we value excellence, and in brackets, personal excellence over community greatness and being able to, be great together?
Well, I think, I love this notion of kind of like the crux of education really does, like it can be distilled down to kinship. And that speaks to some extent to kind of the, what we've all kind of accepted and adopted as, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where the apotheosis of the hierarchy is, of course, self-actualization. But Maslow was inspired, right? Like the hierarchy of needs is derivative of the Blackfoot Nation, right? Where Maslow spent quite a bit of time. And in theirs, self-actualization is actually the base of the pyramid, whereas it's collective communal actualization that exists in the apotheosis. And so to some extent, I guess what I wonder is, this all sounds great, right? Like I think we can all get on board with that and move beyond that notion of, Maslow's before Bloom's and all that. But I think what I wonder is, how do we make that? You can see this, like just doing house events for the kids. How do we create kinship and balance that with rigorous conceptual learning? What might that look like?
I can jump in with an example. I think one of the projects I'm proudest of is one that I've not seen myself yet, and yet we started a school 2 years ago this week. We started designing a new school. It was a terrible time to be designing a new school because we all thought we were going to be in lockdown for 2 weeks and then it would be back to normal. And then 2 years on, we opened the doors in September last year. It's in Romania, in Transylvania, in a beautiful village called Cluj, just not too far from the Ukrainian border. And this is a stunning school called the Kalina Learning Centre. And its purpose, that what we were trying to do with that blank sheet of paper, was work out the purpose of a new school. And we genuinely didn't want to just create another new school, and never did creating another new school feel so irrelevant as in that week in March 2 years ago. So the purpose came out quite quickly, and then we, a bit like Zadie Smith puts her novels in a drawer for a year before she opens them and looks at them again, we put it away for 6 months and thought, let's look at it when this pandemic's over. The joke was on us, but when we looked at it 6 months later, it still resonated, and it was the purpose was to support everyone to learn how to thrive in life, with a vision to build a learning culture throughout every home. Nothing to do with the school, but actually, if you want to build a learning culture, it has to be all the way through into people's homes. And so with that, we had this realization that actually adults are the real curriculum, not kids. It's the adults in young people's life who invariably have a positive or negative effect, or middling effect. And it's the adults who put brakes on kids. It's not the kids themselves. And when you start looking at that, what do? Well, we ended up building a dual curriculum school, a school that's got a curriculum for young people, but it has a curriculum that taps into it that's designed for the adults in their life, whether that's the grandparents, parents, the teachers, whoever. And we just had our initial accreditation visit from NIASC, and they are blown away by what's been achieved in such a short period of time. Why? Because the vision and that purpose are uncompromising. And we started small so we could do both of those things at the same time. Whereas I think most people say, well, let's focus on the kids first and then worry about adult education later. It's a bolt-on, it's a money maker even. We thought, no, it's got to be both of these things together. So I think it can be done, but it's not just about what teachers can do. That's unfair on the teachers and it's unfair on the kids. It has to be that, we're talking about community, it has to be a community effort. And to do that it's a lot of work, and it needs really planned out and thought through and then executed with no compromise.
I love that example. I'd love to learn more about the school that you're talking about, Ewan. And Zach, I think you know that the topic of Maslow's self-actualization as the pinnacle of the pyramid actually being a sort of false extraction from the original theory is something very near and dear to my heart. And that self-actualization as the base, cultural, community connection is what is actually in that model that kind of got left out. And it really does answer the balance between kinship and rigor, in the sense that, there was one point early on about learning versus knowledge. And I think one thing we learned in the pandemic is that learning is natural. Our students, our children, they will learn if we let them. You were born learning. No one had to show you how to learn. So learning is natural, and usually schools are not. And so when we focus on a really narrow definition of success that is focused on what college, university you get into, or how much money you're going to make, that is not, we're thinking a lot about what is an education for humanity, because the needs of the world are demanding us to design and to consider what does that, we've mentioned already today, moving from me to we. What is an education for humanity? So how do we move from what do you want to be when you grow up to what problem do you want to solve? Starting as a kindergartner, you can start thinking about what you care about. It might be puppies, and that is very productive, and it moves on. It might move on to, the state of the earth, the air quality, whatever it might be. But what problem do you want to solve kind of helps to situate you in community and not be so final that it's a high stakes. I have one chance to get into the university so I can study that one thing. I think we're seeing that is not the sort of collaborative, problem-solving, relevant approach that the world is needing.
I was gonna say, yeah, I was gonna say I cannot agree with you more, Homa. And then also wanted to circle back to something Ewan shared. One of what really resonated with your example was the fact of the intentionality that it took to really think about what are the needs of the adults. And so what I'm hearing in our conversation is really thinking about also how do we dismantle some systems that are currently in place when we think about preparation. So immediately my thoughts went to like, how are we preparing teachers? How are we preparing leaders? How are we communicating the skills, mindsets, dispositions that our children need for a world that we don't know yet? And so I think that the important piece of like turning our attention to the adults is not is I think is the really a place where we have lacked a lot of focus and thinking about we oftentimes hear about like what students need for their future, and what you're elevating in your example and is the importance of what adults need to be able to meet the needs for those students, to be able to foster those mindsets, dispositions, skills, to be able to have the ability to ask those big questions like you were speaking to, Homa, is like what we really need as well.
I mean, we could likely just continue on with this single question and just kind of continue to build from there. But I think to honor our three past panelists, why don't we go ahead and transition into question 2 and then kind of pick up the thread of this conversation accordingly. Cool.
For those of us seeking inspiration and guidance, what are some instructive examples of meaningful change that you've witnessed over these last 2 years?
So Ewan, your work takes you around the world, albeit predominantly virtually, right, over these past 2 years. In fact, I actually worked at that school in Joburg that you're referring to. I don't think we've touched on that. But just kind of based on your wealth of global experience, what are some instructive examples of meaningful change that you've witnessed over these past couple of years?
I'll be honest that I used to travel 250,000 miles a year, and I'm very glad I don't now, doing my bit for the environment and doing a bit for my family life, maybe even my health. But I think that less selfishly than that, we actually do better work when we do online, because traditionally school leaders would try and make meaningful change happen in 7 hours on a Saturday in a Marriott. And they would sit in one of these windowless rooms with the vomit-proof carpet, and that would be their source of inspiration for the next 5 years. And it was always 5 years. There's this kind of Stalinistic view that change would happen over 5 years. We'll create a vision and it will all slot into place. And it was all nonsense, but people kind of went with it. And so for the past decade, we've been challenging the 5-year plan. We know it doesn't work. We know schools don't really achieve anywhere close to what they had hoped to with those 5 years. And it also stops them doing different stuff because it wasn't on the plan. And so you wonder why schools don't move forward much. It's because if it's not on the plan, it doesn't happen. And then even the stuff on the plan doesn't happen. So when we broke into more online work, it means that we're working for an hour or two, but then we're setting them off for a week to sleep on it. And there's a great power to sleeping on things and to taking your time. And I love it when a leadership team come back and I think they're going to be at that place, but actually they've gone and done all their fighting beforehand. And when they arrive, they say, we've worked it out, we're over here. And suddenly it's, they've worked out a myriad of stuff that they never would have done in that close environment. So working online, we've been seeing much more intentionality. I think that was the word Patrice used. We always want to be intentional, but I don't think you can be when you cram everything into tight periods where you've got to get it done. Deadlines are artificial. We make them up, which also means you can push them. So take your time, doing it with some kind of process. So we bring a process, but it doesn't really matter. Just a process that you are going to stick to that frees you up from thinking about what do we do next. and instead gives you time to bathe in it. So, that intentionality is important. Having critical friends, it should be your board, but in schools, the board's often there for their own kids' interests rather than the general interest. So you could consider a virtual advisory board as a group of friends, and that might be a board from another school in another continent. Just to have someone different, or it could be Patrice, or it could be Homa, but have someone who can look at your ideas and say, why are you doing that? Or why are you not doing this? So yeah, the most meaningful change we've made over 2 years has been every one of the schools who, in spite of a pandemic, decided that they would do things differently, and they've created a strategy, not a plan, a strategy that they can put to work every day of the year that their whole community's been involved in forming. And like I say, there's 62 of them that we're working with at the moment, and we're desperately trying to wrap them up before summer so we can move on to the next group of schools. But these are spread across different geographies with different pressures. Some are in war zones, some are in areas where the pandemic is still raging, others in areas where it's long since stopped raging, but there's still that fear of bringing people together on campus, for example, for all those community building events. And yet the one thing that binds them all is, if you want to do meaningful change, you've got to have your community behind it, and they've got to be part of it. And a huge part of that in schools is actually not virtual. It's those social objects, concerts, sports tournaments, all those things that bring people together. That's actually where the change can happen quickest.
I would just pick up on what Ewan said. I think what we are seeing with schools around the world is so similar. One of the most meaningful changes is coming from leadership saying, I don't know, I'm here to listen, kind of leading with humility. We are thinking of the idea of radical acceptance, where I know that change, challenge, disaster, things I don't want to happen are coming my way, instability in my country. There's a long list, but instead of sort of, I don't want to know, it's, I'm here for it. And then one way of sort of democratizing decision-making and helping to really push forward change that we've seen is the formation of what we think of as guiding coalitions. And so rather than a board making all the decisions and saying, okay, 5-year strategic plan, like Ewan said, not 5-year strategic plan, but really thinking about a design process that is very dynamic. And as part of that design process, you are bringing together a few students to the table, parents, maybe alumni, various community members, leaders, teachers. And when you have this array of interests at the table, something really creative, fresh, new, and honest comes out. And I think that there is sort of this level of honesty that people, maybe that's the great resignation. We're thinking about the great reflection, that there needs to be a level of honesty in order to get to that next phase. And that's really hard. And that is sort of rooted in saying, I don't know. I need to hear from everybody.
There are 2 points I think you can bring those together. One is we call that a design team at the start of a process of reflection. Mm-hmm. So when the page is really blank and you really don't know. So bringing that design team of students, parents, alumni, board members, leadership, teachers of every grade, bringing them together and getting them going out, interviewing in the community and learning how to ask the right question and capture all that. So we spend, it's the equivalent of about 5,500, 6,000 lines of data just from interviews that we get, plus all the survey data. And then having someone who's dispassionate analyse it and develop the choices that are there for the school to take is, I think, a worthwhile investment. But the second part where I think that coalition, as you put it, is really useful is when it comes to doing the work. I think sometimes people think, well, we were collaborative coming up with the idea. Now I'm going to tell you how it's going to work. And the board still want their plan. And I love what the American School of Warsaw really taken to this and taken to it faithfully, I think, if you like. They've set up sprints of 10 weeks rather than the 10 months of a school year. They've taken the advice of making it opt-in, so it's passion-based. So you end up with these really passionate educators and some students getting involved now in these little doing groups. And the only piece of advice we really had to keep hammering away at was, don't go and do a bloody literature review, do some work. So if you're going to go and do your literature review, great, but make sure that you do something that benefits your student experience right now with what you learned. Don't just sit there reading all day. And what they've done in short bursts of time is phenomenal compared to what it would have taken had they gone at the cadence of kind of 10 months at a time.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and just quickly, Patrice, as you kind of alluded to in your introduction, you've been kind of visiting, you kind of have this intimate knowledge now of all these pockets of innovation around the country. And I'm curious, what are some things that you've seen over the course of these past 2 years that you feel like other educators would really benefit from?
Oh, I think there are two things. One, the power of networks is like what comes to mind first. And then the second is, I know something that's very dear to Ewan's heart is design thinking. So when I think about the power of design thinking and like its integration in teaching and learning, I have seen such amazing things happen. There's a school actually in San Diego called Design 39 campus. And one of my friends was one of the 9 founders of that school. And it's a public school and they were like, we want to do something different. We think that there's some basic skill set, mindsets, dispositions that our students need to have to be able to be entrepreneurial, to be able to have social impact, think about justice and equity. And so I went to visit and to see, first of all, the structure itself, because they have design thinking embedded in it, is like absolutely fantastic because they have been intentional about every single nook and cranny of the place. But that all fades away once you get inside and you see the student engagement. Like that building disappears completely. And that was like one of the most amazing, engaging experiences that I've seen. And that's been beyond 2 years, but it's continued to thrive even throughout the pandemic. And then when I talked about the power of networks and really touched also on something that Ewan said too, is around like school improvement plans and like, the strategic plans that schools are required to put in place. And one of the things that the work that I do is we support launching networks. So I work on a partnership between districts and universities who have come together around a shared problem of practice. And one of those shared problems of practice was around the school improvement and innovation planning process, in which they saw that those plans were made, they went on the shelf, and then they kind of were compliance, check the boxes kind of things. And what they did is they actually leveraged the methodology of improvement science along with design thinking to think about how do you reimagine that process where it really empowers and gives agency to teachers, where it empowers and gives agency to building leaders, where they don't see it as a compliance tool, but an opportunity to continuously learn, to run iterative tests of inquiry, and to make sure that it really was in alignment with what mattered and met the needs of their context. And to be able to see how even throughout the pandemic, they've been able to continue to do this work and see success in it, and see people who are now like, wait, from neighboring districts and other places in the state who are like, we want to come and see what you're doing. I think that was something that I found to be a promising practice, like the power of networks, like accelerating learning when we're all grappling with some of the same things. Like, why are we not putting our, focusing our collective effort to really make impact for our students?
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrice. I was, with all the Post-its and the whiteboard behind you, I was wondering how long we were going to go before design thinking came up in the conversation.
Yes, that's my board back there. I'm planning a retreat right now.
Soon enough. I think one thing I'm wondering, I guess, because I'm hearing a lot about this idea of kind of enlisting community support, right, and being really intentional and really deliberate. And I think about, just working here in a middle school with my own students. And what I'll share with them, kind of circling back to Alma's point, is I'll share with them, I don't know, but it's not because I don't care. It's not because I'm not reflective. It's not because I'm not honest. It's because I don't live the student experience every day. And so I seek to enlist kind of their own expertise and experience so that I can better understand what I can work on in terms of the systems that exist here at school. And I'm curious, what are maybe some models that you all have found that have worked in order to be able to really kind of build buy-in, or is to be able to bring them in kind of the fold of that, to Patrice's point, design thinking process?
I'll go quickly and just say I think that if you're having to get buy-in for something you've already cooked, you left it too late. No one enjoys being on the end of someone trying to get their buy-in. It's an absolutely awful position to be in. So you have to rewind, I think, and go much earlier in the process and actually co-design with learners. It's what you're doing, Zach, by what you've just described. You're negotiating learning outcomes in a classroom. Now multiply that by the whole team in your corridor. Now multiply that by the school, and then try and do it across the state and then across the country. That's where you might have some no need to get buy-in because they're co-designing it with you.
I was going to say that.
You were, no, but
You're like in this headspace. But, I think another thing about buy-in is buy-in implies a sort of, it's like this consumer idea, like I
like
have
salesmanship.
something to sell you. Yeah. I don't want to sell you something. We want to create together. And so if in a design thinking process, empathy is the root, it's the starting point, I think we have to even rethink how we think about empathy. It's like, I know I can't really put myself in your shoes. I don't live your experience. And can we talk about it? Can we figure out how we engage, how we interact? So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to contribute to the buy-in conversation. That is like one of the words that I absolutely I despise that word. And because it does have that more consumer, thought to it, but it also is like, really, I'm trying to like convince, persuade, have you come my way, and it's not really that mutual piece that we want to build in doing that kind of work. And so it's really about fostering commitment. Like, how do you create the relationships and the enabling conditions where people feel committed to doing something, even if it may not be their top priority? Are they willing to contribute their resources, expertise, and time because it's something that they believe will have a greater impact?
Thanks, guys. And why don't we go ahead and why don't we transition into that third and final question, and we can kind of, again, just pick up the thread of this conversation over there.
Hey, let's be realistic. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So what is that first step that teachers and administrators can take to help bring about positive change in their classrooms and schools?
Yeah, I mean, a journey of 1,000 miles does start with a single step, but undoubtedly, and I think we've all seen this, right? It's the hardest step to take. And what we've talked about, because we're talking about the future of schools, it's going to be unavoidable, right? That it's going to be a little bit heady and a little bit nebulous. And I'm curious, let's go from the zooming out and let's really zoom in. What is the first step that a middle level leader, that a school administrator, that an educator, a classroom teacher can take in order to bring some of these ideas to life tomorrow?
Okay, I will definitely, I'll kick us off. Christopher Emden often talks about the importance of just being free and truly loving yourself as an individual. And when you do that, you draw people to you. And when you can see yourself, others can see you as well. And so I feel like one of the first steps that would need to take place when you're thinking about teachers and administrators is just giving them permission to be themselves and show up authentically. Because when you do that, people can actually see you They build greater connection with you because you're not wearing an armor. And I think oftentimes it's especially in the K-12 space where there's a box of like what it looks like to be a teacher or administrator, and you kind of have to fit in this box. It is actually something that alienates students from you and creates that positionality. And I think that when you can show up as your authentic self, it breaks down those barriers.
And I think I'd take it as just building on that. I think that one of the ways that it doesn't really matter who you are, we're advising government ministers to do this at the same time as I would say a classroom teacher can do it. And using the kind of Zoom metaphor, learning how to mute yourself for a moment, because I think that's one of the things that stops young people sometimes being themselves, if they feel that they've got to act up a certain role in front of their teacher. So you can't not be you, but what you can do is shut up and give them a framework and a structure to talk, and it'll take them time. It takes people a lot of time to get into stuff and to get into the meaty stuff. So listening to young people, listening to your colleagues, listening to staff, listening to the parents in your community, listening to the grannies. Actually, the grannies and granddads increasingly are the ones picking the kids up or looking after them at the end of the school day, and they see the fallout of what didn't work in the day. And take it all in and give yourself time to do that. And then at a date, put the date in the diary, you unmute. And that's where I think you need to kind of create your own, we call them manifestos. Create a manifesto for the change you think needs to happen based on everything you've heard. And if you're a classroom teacher, you can do this and put it up on your wall with a nice frame around it. If you're a school leader, you can do it yourself and then take it round as a postcard and ask people if it resonates. But the thing about a manifesto is it's quite personal and selfish, because what you're doing is saying, I'm going to make a promise to try and make sure all these things happen. That's what a manifesto is. It's a set of promises, and it also expresses your purpose as an individual. So it's inherently selfish. And what's interesting is it stops people talking in this weird language that people use in schools. I call it to whom it may concern language, which is not the way anyone has ever spoken to anyone ever. They make it sound like a gas bill rather than something full of passion. So speak in your own voice, the way that you would actually tell an 11-year-old that this is what you're going to promise them, and publish it. And there's loads of versions I think the first one I ever saw was Rosendale Primary School in Brixton in South London, that created a book called How We Learn What We Learn. And you can still find it now online on Scribd or something like that. It was their whole rationale. Fast forward a decade, I got this as a thud through the letterbox during the second lockdown, which was the hardest lockdown for us here. And it was a moment of joy. This is a book written by the 45 amazing nuns at the Col·legi Montserrat in Barcelona, quite possibly the best school on the planet. And we're really happy that we had a role building it. What they did is they spoke to everyone and anyone in education. And I'm on one of these pages here as a contributor to it. And it explains where their ideas for learning and teaching came from. They call it Flow. It's a beautiful book that smells nice. And you want to have a copy. And all the parents get a copy of this. So there's never a question of why is my kid learning that way? Because all the research, all the promise is there. And we've done the same with Călin-Anu, the school in Romania that I talked about earlier, has its manifesto written very much in the first person. And I think that when you document where ideas come from, people will get it. And they don't have to buy into it. They just want to be part of the thing that you're helping to create, because it echoes their voice too. So that would be my first step. It's not quite one step, but it's my first movement, if you like, or first act of change that I think anyone can do.
I would also add this idea of showing up as your authentic self, this liberatory learning that we want to envision ourselves, what's our purpose, being really clear about what school is for, that first question. And one of the things that has been really enlightening and rich that I've seen that we've been doing is having educators realize that everything you do in your school is telling a story. And so what are some of the stories that you are telling? And kind of auditing that, here's the actual story. And so when we pause to listen, which it definitely takes time, you have to go a little slow to go fast. It won't feel as efficient. It's not as transactional. You won't be able to check off all the boxes that you might have. But we've learned in this pandemic that busy is not the same as change and doing. You have to also be, right? So a story audit that looks at what are the actual stories we're telling compared to where do we want to be, what's our aspiration, and that gap between where we are actually and where we hope to be is where the work is.
Yeah, thanks. I love that notion of showing up as your authentic self, right? In both to Toma's point and then also to Patrice's point, especially as administrators, right? Like I think one of my favorite sayings, right, is just that a snake rots from the head. Like nobody else, your staff is not going to show up as their most. Personally, I just believe that dress codes themselves are one of the most visible vestiges of colonialism. It's like you'll never catch me in anything except a t-shirt and Jordans. And that doesn't matter if it's parent night, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, that's what I'm wearing. And for me, it's just, kind of who I am. But I had a teacher come up to me and say how liberated she then felt because she was no longer so self-conscious about what she wore day in and day out. And for me, it's like, well, we shouldn't have teachers who think about that. We want them focused on the kids and the curriculum, certainly not their appearance or what it is that they're wearing each and every day. And I think that all of that kind of circles back, right, more than anything to the three words that Homa shared a little bit earlier, which is, I don't know, right? And being able to be really open and really vulnerable and really honest. And so I'd love to just close today's conversation because as we think about the future, I mean, ultimately, none of us are terribly positioned to be exactly experts on something that we don't know how it's going to, play out. So I guess what I wonder is, what don't you know about the future of education? And what would you like to know about the future of education? And Patrice, why don't we start with you? And then Homa, why don't we go to you? And then Ewan, why don't we end on you?
Sure. So I think I actually started brainstorming some questions. And so I think my question around the future of education is how are we preparing the adults who are interacting with our students, for the world that we don't know as it exists. So I think that's my question.
Thanks, Patrice.
I think I would just say, when I think of future, I think of it in the plural, futures, because I don't know what a singular future would be, but I can imagine a range of futures. And that's been one of the areas that I've sort of dove into since the pandemic is futures thinking. That's been one of my own biggest areas of learning that I'm absolutely fascinated by. So I would say thinking about it in the plural.
I think it's a remarkably tough question, but the one question that I don't think enough young people ask themselves, I don't think that in Scotland, certainly I know that we don't encourage them with this question because we have a kind of tall poppy syndrome thing, is very simple. What do you want? And not being afraid to ask that question and then going about answering it. And the most successful people that I've worked with and met, the people who mentor me, actually have quite a cyclical process where they keep coming back to that question and say, what do I want for me, for my family, for my community, for my country, and what can I do about it? And they will lay it out roughly what they can do to make a dent on reaching it. And you can do it every 5 years if you want to, or you can just do it when those moments come along. But I think most people leave that question until it's too late, when they've found themselves in the position they didn't want to be in, and then they have to they have to unpick it all. I think you can be more proactive and just ask that question: what do you want, and what would it take to get there?
Thank you, and thank you, Ewan, and thank you, Homa, and thank you, Patrice, and thank you, of course, to everyone that has tuned in this evening. Today's conversation, of course, doesn't stop here, right? This is truly one of the most pressing and most needed conversations for us to be having these days. And if you want to continue the conversation, and you want to continue to learn from some of the leading voices in education, please be sure to join the SchoolRubric Facebook group and Global Educators Network. Next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching and learning with us at SchoolRubric with educators from across the globe. For more access to articles, magazines, podcasts, live episodes, our international school directory, courses, and more, visit us at schoolrubric.org. Thank you.